Yeah, time to get going. Well, it's great to see everybody. We might have a couple of latecomers. I
Oh, and
just
Rick
want,
Vaughn, sorry. There's
uh,
Rick.
hi, Rick. So what we're doing today, we thought it'd be fun to feature the J.I. Staley Prize and the 2020 winner of that prize, Lisa Stevenson. The J.I. Staley Prize goes back to 1988 was the first time it was given. J.I. was a very close friend of Doug Schwartz. He was a Texas oil man, and he left us a packet of money to create the biggest and most prestigious book prize in anthropology, which is now in its 33rd year. And basically, it's an unusual prize in the following sense. It's not a sort of the book of the year sort of prize. In fact, you can't even apply until the book's been out for a couple of years, or you can't be nominated. So the book is given to a living author for a book that exemplifies outstanding scholarship and writing in anthropology. It recognizes innovative works that go beyond traditional frontiers and dominant schools of thought. And it also is supposed to be accessible to the general public, which is clearly the case in this instance. So I'm going to do a handoff to Paul, who will introduce Lisa, and then we will give her the floor, or whatever you call it, on an electronic forum like this.
Yes, hello everyone. I know many of you, but I'm Paul Ryer. I'm the Director of Scholar Programs here at SAR, and like Michael, I'm trained as an anthropologist. And it is such a pleasure to welcome Lisa Stevenson and to be able to introduce her a little bit. I will keep it brief. In fact, she has an extraordinary CV, and I won't be able to touch on all of it. Professor Stevenson is an anthropologist in the Department of Anthropology at McGill University in Montreal. She's also a William Dawson Scholar, and Lisa, maybe you can tell us what that means. She received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in 2005. And the central focus of her work in recent years has been the question of what it means to think in images, which was something that is rather subtle for those of you reading her book. That might not be the way you're reading. It wasn't the way I read the book, but it's fascinating to think. She has 2 books and too many articles and book chapters to list. Obviously, one of her books is the Staley winner for this year, titled Life Beside Itself, Imagining Care in the Canadian Arctic, University of California Press, 2014. That book also won the 2015 Victor Turner Prize. Again, the Staley Prize is not a book of the year, it's more of the book of the decade, a book that has had transformative impact within anthropology writ large. And her other book is titled Critical Inuit Studies, 2006, from the University of Nebraska Press. Also, again, I won't go into all of her articles and book chapters, but she also has a short film, Into Unknown Parts, which debuted 3 years ago at the Margaret Mead Film Festival, and which concerns the Inuit experience of being forced to leave their home communities and live for an undetermined period of time in southern Canadian tuberculosis sanatoria. And those of you familiar with SAR over a long time know that one of our own staff scholars has written a book about tuberculosis sanitariums. Sanitaria? It's the plural of sanitarium here in New Mexico. So that's a topic with some interesting local resonances for us. In any case, I think that's enough of her CV. It's my great pleasure to introduce Lisa Stevenson. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that very generous introduction. And I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be here and to just highlight that receiving the Staley Prize. I got the call when I was at our cabin in upstate New York, and I couldn't figure out why Michael Brown was calling me or wanted to talk to me, and I didn't have any cell reception, and Eduardo kept saying to me, my partner kept saying to me, you really got to return that call. And I was like, but I don't have any cell reception. And I have to say, it really was the highlight of my academic career so far. I felt so recognized by this prize. And I think as a woman, it made such a big difference to me and has made a difference in my career. So I just don't know what to say, but I want to say thank you to all of you. I also want to thank Lindsay Archuleta, and I don't know if I said your name right, for organizing this event. And I want to say a special thank you to Michael Brown, Paul Ryer, and Laura Sullivan for making SAR what it is. I was lucky enough to attend one of the SAR seminars in the year before my book came out, and it really, it shaped the opening to the book, because I presented some of that material at the seminar. So the book wouldn't have been the same without SAR. So with that all said, I think I'll share my screen. I prepared a 20-minute presentation, so don't get discouraged. I practiced it a couple of times. It's only 20 minutes. And if you're all ready, I guess, here we go. So here, let me share my screen. Just a minute, I need to, hold on 1 second, do that again. I need to share sound because I have some sound. There we go. Okay, do you see it now?
Yep, everything looks good.
Okay, so I sadly don't see you, so that's fine. I can talk into the kind of void. I've done it before, but if anything goes wrong, please don't wave at me. Please say something to me. Okay? Is that okay? Okay. All right. So as you probably got the sense, Life Beside Itself is a book that grew out of my dissertation research among the Canadian Inuit of Canada during an ongoing suicide epidemic that predominantly affected Inuit youth. So my research took place in the territory of Nunavut, Canada's only territory or province with an Indigenous government. I worked primarily in the community of Iqaluit, but also Pangnirtung and Arctic Bay. During that research, I quickly came to realize that there was a disconnect between how Inuit youth on the one hand and suicide prevention workers on the other hand understood life and what it means to be alive. Inuit youth, for example, would continue to be visited by their dead friends in dreams and in visions. This led to a similar disconnect about what it meant to care for someone who was feeling suicidal, or to care for someone who had already committed suicide and is appearing to you in your dreams. So let me be very clear from the outset. The suicide epidemic among Inuit youth is harrowing for all concerned. Every single person in Nunavut knows someone who has committed suicide. Suicide is a deeply felt wound at both the personal and the collective level. My own nephew, whose mother is Inuk and who was born and raised into Inuit culture, has experienced multiple suicides of close friends, the most recent just a few weeks ago. Suicide has understandably become a site of intervention for doctors, for nurses, for social workers, for teachers, and also for politicians. Almost everyone feels moved to do something. Emerging from an interdepartmental meeting on suicide, a Government of Nunavut employee remarked ruefully to me, "Just seems like a competition to see who cares the most." But what does it mean to care for a suicidal Inuit person? And how do Inuit experience that care? These are the central questions that pursued me during my research. So to be brief, the suicide prevention models in place in the Canadian Arctic operated on what we might call the medical model, privileging physical, biological life, or what we've come to call life itself, over all other forms of life and ways of being together in the world. And thus, the forms of care were also designed to preserve just that. They were designed to preserve that bare biological life of suffering youth. So in the book, I characterize the paradigmatic mode of responding to Inuit youth suicide as what I call anonymous care. Anonymous care and the impulse I was just talking about to preserve life at any cost have a necessary connection. Anonymous care, because it holds the specific details of a life in abeyance, makes the texture and specificity of a particular life irrelevant, or relevant only insofar as the survival of that physical life is ensured. So in some sense, it's not surprising that one of the most important suicide prevention programs in the territory was a suicide hotline. In a suicide hotline, where anonymity is a central part of the mode of care, personal biography is relevant only insofar as it can keep someone alive. So the very important thing in this, for the story that I'm telling now, is that anonymous care is an anathema to small Inuit communities, where everyone knows everyone, and where, in fact, names and souls are intimately connected. You can start to imagine the cultural disconnect here. To care anonymously is to hold the name of the person you are caring for in abeyance. I care, but it doesn't matter for whom I care. But in the Inuit tradition, when a baby is born, it is immediately given the name or atik of a deceased ancestor. This gift of the name allows the soul or the life force of that ancestor to come to inhabit the baby's body. There is no way then to distinguish the idea of the name from the idea of the soul. And to care anonymously is, in a certain sense, to ignore the very source of life in Inuit communities. So I wanted to tell you a story to give you a sense of how the life force of the atik, the name soul, continues to matter to the younger generations of Inuit. This is a story that a young friend of mine told me. She told me the story in order to explain to me the origin of what she called her Inuktitut name, Ituk. And so when kids went to school, they could never use their Inuktitut name. And so these names would be reserved for use in the family or the community. So her Inuktitut name was Ituk. So to understand the story I'm about to tell, you have to know that the Inuktitut word amak means to carry a baby on your back in an amounti, like these women are doing. And if you can see my cursor here, you can see that the baby is right here at the bottom of this kind of pouch at the back of this coat. So here is my friend's story. She says, my mom was pregnant with me, and this old guy died. His name was Ituk. And my mom had a dream. And in the dream, the old man was asking my mom to amak him, like put him on her back like a baby. And my mom was like, holy cow, you're too heavy. And so upon awakening, Jesse's mother knows that she has to call her baby Ituk. And only then, since his atik or name soul would come to be in the young girl's body, would she, the mother, actually be able to amak him as he requested. So Jessie, my young friend, whose Inuktitut name is Ituk, then tells me the story of the night her brother died. And she's forever marked by this death, a death she narrowly escaped, and one that she turns over and over in her memory. And she says to me, the night my brother died, I had nowhere to go, and so I went to find my brother. They were drinking at this place, and I was just watching them drinking. I was waiting for my brother to go home so I can walk with him or whatever, get a ride or something. And when the bottle was gone, my brother didn't look very drunk, but when he stood up, he almost fell. That's when we all realized how drunk he was. So one of the kids who had been drinking had his parents' ATV. And so a bunch of the kids pile on. Jesse's brother gets onto one side, and Jessie wants to get on too, but she has a crush on one of the boys that's sitting on the ATV. And so she feels too shy to get on, and she decides to wait for the next ride. She tells me more about that pivotal moment. She says, "So I said, I'll wait until the second trip. Jimmy, the driver, was supposed to drop off my brother Isaac at home, then drop off the others, and then come back. My brother Isaac didn't have a helmet on. He was just laughing and saying, achai, achai, like being scared. He said, go slow. And Jimmy was like, don't worry, I'm gonna drive slow. And me and my friend Kakik watched them drive off. And as soon as they drove off, it started raining, like lightly. And then it started to get heavier and heavier. I asked Kakik to borrow $5 for a cab, but I think there were no more cabs on the road. We waited for like an hour for them to return, but they never did. And Kakik was joking around and saying, they crashed. And we just giggled a bit. And then Kakik said, fuck this, I'm walking home. At the time of the crash that killed Jesse's brother, her best friend Sila was pregnant. When Sila's baby was born, she gave it her brother Isaac's name, the brother of Jesse's, Isaac's name. Jessie told me that the first time she went to visit her friend's baby in the hospital, she realized that the baby had been born with the left side of his face paralyzed, just as Isaac's left side had been wrecked from the ATV accident the night she visited him in the morgue. Moreover, Jessie tells me that her brother Isaac, quote, he always done what he wanted to do and whatever he was thinking. Every time somebody would take a picture of him, he would just put up his middle finger. She tells me about going to visit the baby in the hospital that bears her brother, the baby that bears her brother's name in the hospital. She says, and you know when newborns move their hands? When we went to visit him in the hospital, he put up his middle finger for a couple of seconds. Because the baby had been given Jesse's brother's name, the baby had received Jesse's soul and even some physical characteristics. For Inuit, a baby who is not given a name will not survive. No baby can survive without fundamental connection to death, without a fundamental connection to death and to the self or the soul of the dead. So one of the lessons I take from this is that if, as anthropology contends, we are truly social beings, then in a very real sense for all of us, and not only for the Inuit, who we are and how we survive depends on the ways that we are named. But what I began to realize after finishing my dissertation research was that anonymous care did not arrive in the Arctic with the institution of suicide hotlines in the 1980s. In fact, anonymous care in Inuit communities has a long history, at least going back as far as the imposition of Inuit disc numbers. In 1941, the Canadian government initiated a program that would provide Inuit with identification numbers on fiber discs to be worn around their necks, like dog tags for the military. The paternalism, but also the ignorance of the government officials at that time is clear. For instance, the medical officer who proposed the disc number system suggested that upon birth, each child be, quote, given an identity disc on the same lines as the Army identity disc and the same insistence that it be worn at all times. The novelty of it would appeal to the natives. He added, as far as the Eskimo is concerned, it does seem to me that this names business is of no great concern to them. As we've seen, nothing could be further from the truth. The disc numbers were supposed to facilitate census taking and to help Inuit access education and different forms of welfare provided by the Canadian state. They would also, importantly, help shore up Canadian sovereignty in the far north. In fact, Canadian state agents used the Inuit presence on the land as evidence of Canadian sovereignty over the Arctic. They needed Inuit bodies as Canadian citizens to survive in order to demonstrate their occupation of the land. Dr. Helen McMurtry, who was a Canadian medical pioneer, made this claim very forcefully in a 1930 letter to the Prime Minister of Canada, where she urged the Prime Minister to provide medical care to Inuit populations. And we can read it together. She says, "The Canadian Eskimo are perishing off the face of the earth. We have the power and the knowledge needed to save them, and a plan for this is now before the Department of the Interior. If we fail them, the result will be that the Eskimo will be exterminated, and that at no distant rate. If we lose the Eskimo, we lose the Arctic." So, after finishing my dissertation research, I became curious about what might be learned by juxtaposing the response of the Canadian state to the tuberculosis epidemic that swept through the Canadian Arctic in the 1940s to the 1960s. The response to both epidemics was often couched in humanitarian or life-saving terms. Both were attempts to keep Inuit alive at all costs. If we lose the Eskimo, we lose the Arctic. They both utilized forms of anonymous care. So from the 1940s to the 1960s, this was another slide of Inuit man David Arnatsiak in 1945 being given his disc number and having a picture taken with it. From the 1940s to the 1960s, Inuit were evacuated from northern communities to southern hospitals over 3,000 miles away. So there's a picture of a northern community. This is near Iqaluit. It's near Apex, which is near Iqaluit, circa 1958. And here is a friend of mine, the father of a friend of mine, who was an Inuit TB patient in the mountain sanatorium in Hamilton, Ontario. Inuit were usually taken by ship and then transferred by train or plane. The medical record shows that in the mid-1950s, 1 out of every 7 Inuit was in a tuberculosis sanatorium in southern Canada. Inuit who died in hospital were buried in unmarked graves. Again, notice the anonymity of the care, and news of their deaths didn't always make it home. In June 2008, I received an email from a woman in Arctic Bay who had been trying for years to locate her great-grandmother's body. "My name is Anna," she wrote to me. "A few years ago, I was in search of my dad's grandmother that passed away on the train to Hamilton, the Hamilton Sanatorium, but they unloaded her body before reaching the sanatorium. Kaujak, Anna's great-grandmother, had raised Anna's father as a son. When I interviewed Anna's father a month after receiving the email, he wept as he told me about the last time he saw his grandmother. He had been unloading supplies from the CD Howe. There's the CD Howe in the background and the supplies in the foreground. When he saw his mother smiling and posing for a photograph as she was taken back to the boat. That fall, they heard over the CB radio the news that she had died. Nothing more. All Anna now has is an index card from the government files with Kaujak's name and disc number typewritten on it. Handwritten in ink are the words "dead" and 1956. The story of Kaujak's death what happened, who she was with, where her body was taken, is an enigma that has never been resolved. Each time the ship would return, and that was once a year, her son would go to the beach where people were loading and unloading its cargo and listen. He was listening, he explained to me, in the hope that someone would someday mention her, her death, or anything about her. So not surprisingly, Inuit did not always cooperate enthusiastically with the evacuation effort. Some Inuit families would quickly abandon the settlements when they heard the news that the ship was on the way. Others, who had been let off board after testing positive for TB, would refuse to return to the ship. Inuit also often found the separation from their families difficult to accept. Inuit did not have access to telephones, and while they were encouraged to write letters to each other to assuage the pain of separation, the ship that brought the letters from the south only visited the communities once a year. So here are some images of the journey south. In 1961, a social worker had the idea to start recording voice messages from Inuit patients in the south to their families up north, and vice versa, messages from families up north to the hospitalized patients. I was able to find one of these tapes in the Hamilton archives, and I had it digitized. I want to let you listen to this tape, but I want to first, later in my archival research, I went and met the whole family that you're going to hear on this tape. But later, even after meeting the family, I found these images in the Northwest Territory archives. And on the left, you have Ituk, who you will hear. He just happens to have the same name as my friend, but that's Ituk. And who you'll hear talking on the tape, and Akikiakjuk, the woman he is talking to on the tape. And here's another image of Ituk in the background, and the three children. You will also hear their voices on the tape. So I'm going to play the tape for you. So this was recorded in 1961.
Message number 3. This is Ituk E5213 of Arctic Bay speaking to his wife Akikiakjuk E5214 in Mountain Sanatorium, Hamilton.
Taba itu pukang naripok Nuria minyak E5213 Ija kama katakawak pagin Ija nido actual kama bangin sakin Akane ardo sa jadi isi makakon ni sa punga manari time tumnek punga ako ni ujuk pagkalwak sa ilan isi makafi o katarpo punga pagin actual nagligi bagid lo actual Cuma kita kata taruh sama tak bau terpelit suara akhirnya kamu karena
tak bau di aksuar anak
anak-anak ini terbau di aktual.
So I think one of the things maybe I didn't emphasize enough for you to be able to understand this tape is that Inuit wouldn't know the status of their relatives in hospitals. So as they're making these tapes, they don't know whether their loved ones are still alive or not, or whether they'll survive the year or not. It has already occurred that people have gone down south and not returned. They got lost down south. So the kind of sense of dislocation was intense. So, oops, sorry. Examining the Inuit perception that there is something uncaring or even murderous about such anonymous and bureaucratic care has become an important dimension of my research. And of course, I want to emphasize that the Canadian state also always felt like it was caring for the Inuit and that it was trying to save the lives in a humanitarian sense of the Inuit. And so the disconnect, of course, is why did Inuit on one hand feel that these forms of care were murderous when they obviously were not intended that way? So the question I guess I want to ask is it not possible that such forms of anonymous care, especially when they focus on the physical lives of others, can, in a certain sense, be understood as killing something? Perhaps not the physical body, but something. An Inuit man called David certainly thought so. In 1959, in the community then called Frobisher Bay and now known as Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut, the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, began to shoot and kill Inuit sled dogs. And this is because the Inuit sled dogs were deemed a health hazard. The RCMP saw their actions as a way of taking care of the community. Many Inuit saw the incident as an attempt to end their way of life. David even wondered if the RCMP would soon begin to shoot the Inuit next. So just to conclude, were the true intentions of the Canadian state and its agents murderous or caring? What explains the difference of opinion between the RCMP and the Inuit? What does it mean to care? Clearly, the Canadian state was not killing Inuit directly, yet many Inuit have felt that there was something murderous behind their assertion of care. Where did this feeling come from? I think to answer those questions, we need to ask why no one bothered to remember where Kawjak was buried. Why did Arctic administrators think this name business was of no great interest to Inuit anyway, when it is clearly central to their understanding of who they are and what it means to be alive? And why were the Inuit who died in the sanatoria buried in unmarked graves? And finally, bringing us back to the beginning of the talk, we need to think about how Inuit youth feel when they are told to stay alive at all costs, when the details, biographies, and wounds of their lives are considered relevant only when they can be a means to keeping them alive. Thank you. I guess that ended on a little bit of a dark note.
It's really powerful material, Lisa. So I guess the obvious question is, I mean, given that our healthcare system is oriented to precisely the kinds of things you've talked about, in which the Inuit find so unsettling, what's the alternative? How do you make a hospital or a medical setting personal in the sense that that they understand it?
Yeah, I mean, and I do think that it's a larger question for healthcare more generally. I mean, when we think about how many people go into hospitals and feel like they're being treated as bodies, but not being taken care of in a kind of more holistic sense, we can kind of have a little bit of a sense of what the Inuit were experiencing, right? And so it's just a question of I think teaching ourselves, and I mean, this is going to sound like a simple answer, but teaching ourselves, our children, our students, to constantly be looking for that spark of life, spark of aliveness in every human face, in every number that comes to represent a human life. Because the problem, what really happened with the Canadian Inuit, is that they seem to forget, like it didn't matter which Inuit was alive or dead, it just mattered how many were alive or dead. And so it became really about the kind of what in the literature is called this kind of biopolitical, which means your politics becomes focused on the biological life of the people in your nation state. So your politics, meaning the Canadian state at that moment, was deeply embarrassed by its treatment of the Canadian Inuit and wanted to prove that it could do something to change the numbers. But in doing so, it created a situation where Inuit ended up feeling intensely disrespected. And even, as I argue provocatively in the book, but I have so much evidence of it, they felt like the Canadian state really wanted to kill them. So they felt like eventually they would come after them too. They would start with the dogs, and later it would be the Inuit. For the moment, we're useful to them. We take up space on Canadian territory, but what happens tomorrow? But so I don't know. So I guess the answer to your question is not really, I didn't give you a good policy answer because I don't work in hospitals at the moment, but I think the philosophical or the spiritual answer is that we keep teaching each other to look for the kind of specificity, what makes that person who's in front of us special, different, alive, unique. What is the biography of this person that means that they are different from all other people on earth, right? And somehow I think that people going into southern, we call it southern in Canada when they're in Toronto or Montreal are southern hospitals, but people in southern hospitals also feel more cared for when that happens.
Thank you. I'm sure there are other questions.
I actually kind of have two questions, and you can like answer one and not the other or both. One is, I would be interested to know something more about the research you did.
Mm-hmm.
So do you speak their language? Did you go live there for a while? What's the background there? My second question has to do with your initial subject matter about the youth suicides.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked less about that. And I wondered to what degree, I mean, you've got a very isolated community.
Mm-hmm.
And, if one, I mean, we know that, if somebody goes in and shoots up a store, and then all of a sudden we have a string of mass shootings. And the same happens in communities, like at a school or in a town where, one child commits suicide and then the other one gets it. Well, it gets it, not so much copycat, but just gets it in their mind and they're unhappy and, it happens. So, I mean, those are totally.
Yeah, those are really wonderful questions. So I'll start from the first one. So when I'm Canadian, but I did my undergraduate degree at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and I had a internship one year, and I was able to, decide where I would go and what I would do. And I had always wanted to go to the Canadian Arctic. That's a longer story, but it was my dream. And so the fellowship office at UNC Chapel Hill said, okay, that's a strange thing, but yeah, if you want to go. And so that was my beginning of work in the Canadian Arctic. I was 21 and I went as an intern with the Canadian Mental Health Association, and I worked with Inuit who had been recently diagnosed by Southern psychiatrists as schizophrenic. And so the Inuit, the parents who were of an older generation of these, 20-year-olds who have been diagnosed as schizophrenic didn't accept this diagnosis, right? Because they would say two things. One, well, this is a disease, a white person's disease, so you've brought it to us. It didn't exist in our previous communities. We don't understand what it is. And so my work at that point was to try to bring together the community to talk about these issues, just so that there would be some kind of conversation between the psychiatric community and the Inuit community, and then also to begin setting up some kind of drop-in center where people who had been diagnosed with mental illness could have a space to hang out and kind of talk to one another. And so that was kind of the beginning. And then, I went on to do my PhD in anthropology, and I decided I wanted to go back again to the Canadian Arctic, and, wanted the topic really to come from the community. So I went back to Iqaluit and started doing preliminary interviews, and people said, suicide was really the question that was concerning them the most. And so I stayed there for about 14 months. I'd been an intern before. I'd actually done another stint of preliminary research before, and then I stayed there for 14 months, working very closely with youth organizations. So I was in some sense kind of embedded in these youth organizations, and the youth kind of adopted me as one of their own, and they would sort of, and this is a very Inuit thing to do, right? Kind of categories of exclusion just don't work very well in Inuit communities. So, Southern grants would have the kind of definition of youth from, I don't know what it was at the time, I can't remember, but it would be like 14 to 20. And you could apply for money for youth programs if you were 14 to 20. And I think I was like 28 at the time. And they said, oh, no. So youth then, it goes to 28. Because whoever I was, it had to count within that category, And so it was a really beautiful time. And I don't know, I think that I didn't mean it to, but it's my book and my presentation today and trying to sort of summarize for you, the argument came out sounding pretty dark, but I loved working with Inuit youth and found them so funny and so alive and so attentive. Like, as I said, and didn't get in it very intensely, but they have rich relationships with people alive and dead, right? And that's a part of their cultural heritage. And, I did not want to leave. At the end, when I needed to go back to Berkeley, which is where I did my PhD, I kept hoping that, maybe I wouldn't get that next grant, so I could figure out a way, grant to write my dissertation, so I could figure out a way to stay longer. And as you might have guessed from the intro to my talk, my brother came, he followed me up there and has lived there ever since. And so I have this whole family connection, and my nieces and nephews are all considered Inuit. Okay, so that's sort of the broad story. So I have, a lot of connections to Nunavut at the moment. And then the second question is about all of these what I would call contributing causes to suicide. And I think the really difficult thing in Nunavut is, there probably are a lot of what we would call contributing causes. But so far, it hasn't helped us in, like, the suicide rate is the same now, really, as it was when I was working there. And as I said, my nephew had yet another friend commit suicide a couple of weeks ago. And I think my strong sense is that we need to start asking questions about what I've called it in the book, this question of the psychic life of colonialism. And so that's the way that even, and it's particularly difficult, I think, in the Canadian context, because the Canadian state was always ostensibly and overtly trying to care for the Inuit, but the way that the Inuit as a collectivity felt so misrecognized and diminished, right? And the way that that kind of generational, the transmission of that through generations, I think is really crucial, right? You know, I can tell a really personal story of my sister-in-law. So her grandmother lived in northern Quebec. So she, you know, for generations, right? Her Inuit group had lived in northern Quebec, and in the 1950s, the Canadian government, for these questions of sovereignty that I alluded to briefly, said, you know, we really need more Inuit way up north, because that's where the incursions are going to come from the Russians or the American. They were also worried about American Air Force bases. And so they went to this grandmother of my sister-in-law and said, would you mind, you know, moving up north? We hear that there's really good caribou up there, and the seal hunting is really good, and we'll take you on the ship. That same ship you saw the picture of, we'll take you on the ship. So, I mean, this is a long story and has also to do with Inuit ilira, which means kind of fear of authority. So Inuit would have felt very much a fear of authority of the person who came and said, would you come with us? So they agreed to try. They got on the boat. They firmly believed that they could look around and come back on the boat as it made its way back down. But they got up to what is now Resolute, and I guess I'm not sharing the screen, or I would show you the map, and they dropped them off and left. And there was an RCMP military base there. There was no caribou, no good seal hunting, and they began to starve. And they began then to eat out of the RCMP garbage. And that fact of being reduced to eating out of the garbage of the white man really passed through the generations. And my sister-in-law, one of her really powerful memories of childhood in that town, Resolute, because they never were allowed to go back, is, you know, having nothing monetarily or commodity wise, and going over to the white school teacher's house, you know, who had a young girl who was, you know, her friend, and feeling so jealous, but more than that, diminished, right? I have nothing, you have everything. And I think that this kind of, the psychic life that this generates seems to me particularly important. It's not to dismiss all of the other contributing causes, right? And I think we see that in the issue of mass shootings too, right? Like there's so many different causes. But how do we think differently about guns? How do we think differently? I don't know. You know, they're similar in some ways. I think we could draw some interesting parallels. I'll leave it there. But thank you. Those are really important questions.
Anne?
Be unmute. I love the fact that you seem to kind of weave Walter Benjamin's idea of the aura.
Yeah.
I've really looked at that so much in terms of art, but to look at it, in fact, of the individual person,
right?
I thought was foundational to the kind of the entire book.
Oh, yeah. I've never had that question before. That's so beautiful.
Well, I did, and then I love the French theorist Michael Foucault that you brought in as well. And it seemed to me that you were making the point very recursively as you went through. But I thought so much of this is so profound, not just for the Inuit, but really for the much broader spectrum of our culture, of all of our cultures.
Mhm.
So I really appreciated it. But tell me, so where did Walter Benjamin fit into this for you? Where did you kind of become introduced to his theories?
Yeah, well, okay, so those are a number of different questions, but I just want to thank you for the question because nobody's noticed that before. And I do think it's really important. And right after I finished writing the book, I wrote another piece that I've never published, which was about all the images in the book that even though it was published, wouldn't let go of me. It was like I became possessed sounds a little bit strange, but in some ways, the images had a hold on me. They wouldn't let go of me. And I think that was my understanding of Benjamin's aura in this second sense, that there's there's a kind of, in certain images, and not all images, you can sense a kind of aliveness that won't let you go. And it's like the kind of photograph of your mother or father that you keep in your wallet, where there's just something about the turn of the gaze, the turn of the head that speaks to you of who they really are, but you can't exactly put it into words for someone else. But it's like you could never rip up that photograph and throw it out. It would be like you were hurting a living thing, right? And so for me, such photographs, have a kind of power over us. And in this way that Walter Benjamin wanted to direct our attention to. And so, I mean, I don't want to get too much into my intellectual biography, but it was a really dear professor from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, William Peck, who first introduced me to Walter Benjamin and his theory on the philosophy of history. And it has been totally central to my way of thinking since then. I mean, it's amazing how undergraduate professors can sometimes really do that for you, I guess. So I don't know if I answered all the aspects of your question, but I really appreciate you noticing that because, yeah, it's the first time.
And in Texas, we say Walter Benjamin because it was
Oh, yeah.
Larry McMurtry, Walter Benjamin at the Dairy Queen.
Okay,
So
Walter Benjamin. And
it's interesting to hear you say it differently.
Benjamin. Yeah, I don't know where I got that. I don't know, but I have been doing that for years somehow. And my son is Benjamin, and in Spanish we call him Benjamin. And my husband speaks Spanish to the kids, and yeah.
Any other comments, questions?
I had read the book closely and I didn't really pick up the importance of Benjamin. So that's lovely to learn.
Yeah.
And embarrassing a little bit, but that's how it works, right? You read things and then reread them and it's almost like a whole new reading. But so thank you, Anne, also for that taught me something. I just wanted to sort of say, you're probably aware of this, most of us here today are living in the Southwest, and one of the powerful things about your work is that although it's about its own context, Lisa, it does resonate with a lot of the dynamics, of course, in New Mexico and in this
Right.
region as well. Very parallel kinds of encounters. Obviously, some differences, and their historic differences, and their different nation states, and their different native groups or First Nations, but nevertheless, the book, without trying to do more than describe its own context in really deep ways, speaks to, I think, to those of us who are part of a different world that's also in a lot of ways got huge parallels. So thank you for that. And of course, also in anthropological terms, I'm not sure, I mean, we each read these out of our own background, but you're also picking up on Foucault and on Agamben's work and pushing us further as anthropologists. And so when I read the book and I saw all these different layers And you're challenging a Western biomedical model that we all take for granted, that care is, that suicide hotlines are, of course, an automatic good, and that the goal of extending life anonymously, for most of us, we've grown up understanding that of course is a good, not to be questioned or beyond question. And so, gosh, your work is really more than provocative. I think it's revolutionary in a lot of ways. And so I'm glad that we were able to recognize it, and I appreciate it more every time I think about it in new ways. And so that's also the mark of a great piece of work. So thank you.
Thank you. I mean, just responding to that and responding to the question of, I think, Frantz Fanon is one person who has really written about the kind of psychological aspect of colonialism, and that many different forms of colonialism share that same psychological aspect. And he puts it so beautifully when beautifully but terrifyingly, when he says the thing that that colonialism does is force the colonized to ask, who am I? So you lose all sense of who you are, right? And that was so obvious to me in the way that the Canadian state obviously paid no attention to Inuit names or who they were or what they felt about souls or lives, or whether they wanted to go south for tuberculosis treatment or not, so I do think that we can talk about some of the general structures of colonialism while being faithful also to, as you point out, everything has its own very specific context and plays out in very specific ways. But when I finished my dissertation research, I read a short story by Sherman Alexie. What you pawn, I will redeem is the short story. It was in the New Yorker shortly after I finished. And I thought, oh no, I don't need to write a dissertation anymore. Because I think he really got at, I think at that point, what I was struggling with was this feeling. He's writing about Native peoples on the west coast of the United States, right? So not in Arctic Canada, not even Arctic US. But what I thought he really got at was this form of sociality, and by that I mean just ways of being together, really profound ways of being together in the midst of deep pain and suffering. So he's writing about very alcoholic young Indigenous man who is spending all his time in the bar, and then has this kind of but has these friends that kind of come into his life and go out of his life. But the moments that they're there, that bond is real. And I felt like that was so hard to communicate when I came back, because this stereotype of the drunk Indigenous person, the drunk Indian, was so intense. And to kind of get at the beauty that occurs in the middle of so much pain was something that I felt that Sherman Alexie did so well. And he's, yeah.
Lisa, we're just about out of time.
Oh, sorry.
Well, no. Before you go, what's next? Do you have a sense of what? Can you tell us what you're working on now, or where you think the project is going?
Well, so I have shifted recently, but I've shifted away from the Canadian Arctic for the time being, and I'll eventually go back. As I say, I have so many friends and relatives there. It's a part of me. But my most recent research has been with Colombian migrants into Ecuador, and I am currently making a film. So I wake up every morning and actually work with the kind of images on the screen and think about how they fit together and how they tell stories, which is a very different way of storytelling. And I love it. And I think that it plays into my whole theorizing about what is an image and what can an image do that a kind of number can't do, or a fact, because images ultimately can hold contradiction, right? Because they don't have to specify what it is they're talking about.
That's something for us to look forward to. Well, thank you very much for a talk that we won't forget anytime soon, that's for sure. And I look forward to officially presenting you the prize a year later in the fall. And if it's not this fall, it'll be next fall, depending on the visa situation and entry and the COVID and the rest. But we really appreciate you willing to join us.
Can I say something? I feel badly that I talked on, and if there's any question, I'm happy to take them by email.
I saw Steve had a hand up. I was curious what his question would be.
I missed that, Steve. You want to go for it?
I think not. I'll let it pass for now. So.
Do send me an email.
Oh,
Okay.
Steve Feld, you're muted.
I think I unmuted. I said.
Oh, Steve, no, we got you.
Two Steves. There are
Two
Steves.
Steves, two Steves. There's
My
another
apologies.
Steve.
Steve Feld,
No,
do
I'm
you
just-
have a question?
Yes, I'm just super curious if Lisa could share something with us about the issue of anonymity and space. You know, those of us who live here in Santa Fe, many of us got to know, and I had the pleasure to work with Edward T. Hall. And Ned Hall was a consultant to the American Indian Health Service here in the United States. And when a new hospital was being built in Santa Fe, he was actually asked to consult about the use of space, particularly around the question of what is anonymity and privacy for Native people, and why does it matter? And so as I hear you talk about, you know, this issue of anonymity, and the issue there, as Ned described it in his writing and other things, was how do you create spaces where families are welcome and where social relations are honored, but at the same time, privacy, particularly acoustic privacy, is kept at an absolute maximum. And this was the big issue here. And so I'm interested in, I mean, are there people who are sensitive to this issue of anonymity vis-a-vis privacy, and does it affect the way institutions, hospitals, youth clubs, whatever, how these things are actually physically constructed in space? And is there anything positive here in terms of pick up on this, in terms of, you know, I mean, the way architects or government people or activists or NGOs are trying to implement, you know, better social spaces or institutional spaces?
I think it's a fascinating question, and I would love to read anything you could send me on his consultations. I should know it, and I don't know it. I think the whole history of designing space in the Canadian Arctic is absolutely fascinating. I didn't put any on my slideshow, but I have images of the first houses, you know, with separate bedrooms, where the Inuit were used to sleeping on platforms, right? Where the whole family, either in a sod house or in an igloo, where the whole family would sleep one beside each other, you know, boys, girls, mother, father, grandmothers, all one beside each other. And then all of a sudden they were given these houses with tables and separate rooms, and their sense of what to make of this space. And so the stories are really fascinating of people pulling all of the bedroom furniture into one room and all sleeping in one room, right? And so just modifying the space in their own ways. I think they did a particularly bad job with the kind of more institutional space in the hospital in Nunavut, which is like a, you know, for any major medical issues, you have to be flown down south, but it just looks like any other hospital that you might run into in a small town in Canada. But you're inspiring me to do more of that work. I started it a few years ago and kind of dropped it, about way the colonial approach to architecture, and then, what's happening now, because they have a new plans for an art center in Iqaluit, and it'll be really interesting to see what they do in that space, right? Because I think there's a lot of Inuit involvement in that project. That's an exciting thing to end on. A new art space in Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut, that's being galvanized by Inuit voices, Inuit ideas.
Well, Lisa Stevenson, thank you again, and thanks to all of you for joining us.
Okay.